Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Jason's Take On podcast. We've got myself, Jason Noble, based over here in sunny London in the UK, and my partner, Jason Whitehead, over in the US. A quick hello there, Jason.
Hi, everyone. Great to have you with us again today. Thank you for joining.
This is another episode. We're coming up for, I think we've almost done 36 episodes. I was counting the other day, and I cannot believe it's over 2 years now that we've been doing them. But today we're going to talk about false assumptions and myths that are killing your customer success program. So a really topical item to talk through. Myself and Jason just talking through with some really good conversation pieces. We'll throw each other a few questions. Please don't forget to have a look at our pages on LinkedIn, on Twitter. Do let us know what you think. We've got some number of really important guests or really key guests in the customer success world that we've done recently. We're posting some more podcasts with guests up there soon. So do have a listen. Let us know what you think. But we will jump right in. But before that, what we will do, we always have a bold challenge question on our podcast. And for this month, or this podcast rather, the bold challenge question is we want to challenge you to identify 3 to 5 assumptions that are the foundation for your customer success program, and identify a couple of those, so 1 to 2, that are no longer valid going into 2021. So what assumptions have you got now? What assumptions will be invalid going into 2021? Yes, we've had a pandemic. There could be a lot of key things that change there, but have a think about that and let us know your thoughts on that.
Great. So thanks for kicking us off, Jason. We often like to start, why are we even talking about this topic? And just to create some context here, why are we talking about false assumptions and why is this so important? And why are we talking about it now?
I think I love starting the podcast with these kind of questions as well, and then ask us, well, hang on a second, why are we talking about that? And I think when we kind of work through it and have a little brainstorm with ourselves, it helps us reset and think why we're doing it and validate why we're thinking about it. And I think for this one, it's a really key thing. And I think as with any program in business, with any tools, with any service, anything you're providing, you've always got to validate, at least probably annually, the assumptions that you're working to. Those assumptions can and do change. So it isn't just related to customer success. And I think it's important to realize that at the outset. I think the other thing is, given the nature of customer success, given the different levels of maturity, given the pace of change we're seeing in the industry, given that particularly now we're in the middle of a global pandemic, it becomes even more important to keep reassessing your assumptions, and actually more and more of them will keep changing. So I think there is that big need now to revisit them more often. And I think you've got to look at, make sure your programs are right. Are they delivering the values that your customer want? Are they delivering the outcomes your customer want? Are they working for you internally? Look at how things have changed for us as providers, as service providers, platform providers. How have they changed for our customer? How have they changed in the current local and global situations? And how do all these changes in the world impact how we should be interacting with our customers? If you take the example of something like COVID, it absolutely has changed how we interact with customers. We can't meet with them as much physically. We have to interact with them very differently, but you've got a lot of change that's going on there.
Yeah.
I think one of the other key things I'd say is when programs are starting up, you often don't have much information to base your programs on and what you're trying to do. And they are natural assumptions that you start with. I think a lot of our own thinking about customer success at the beginning is always less mature as we start refining the program. So I think you've always got to think about revisiting these assumptions to make sure that they're correct.
You know, I think you've got a lot of good points there too. And especially like with the COVID example, if you would go to most anyone, say a year ago, is this what you thought customer success would look like? You'd probably get a very different answer. And the needs have changed so quickly, as well as the opportunities have changed as well too. And if you don't keep up with that and keep paying attention to that, you can continue down a bad road. And I also think like the COVID example too, when it first started to hit and things were really in, March, April timeframe, in that panic phase, people were throwing up their arms and go, what do we do? What do we do? And things have mellowed out now in the sense that people are a little less manic than they were. And okay, we've got some room. We've learned some lessons even in a few short months. What do we need to tweak now? And how do we get there? And how do we do that?
I think that's a really key point. It just shows that there's assumptions we had coming into 2020. I think everyone had grand plans, visions. Those changed in March. And then, like you say, we had to revalidate and change some of our assumptions. And now they've changed again because we have stabled a little bit, reached a level of stability now, but things are still changing. So I think you've got to be very open to change and really validating things and make sure that you're not working to what were false or what were previously valid assumptions that are no longer correct.
Yeah, actually, I work with a couple of clients in the education technology space, and several of them When all this first started, there was no planning. It was whoa, schools are closed, get out. Well, what do we do? And then they tried to figure it out in the summer. And then when the school started, or when schools came back in session in the fall, many of them were still remote, some were hybrid, some were all over the map. And now so there was, again, another change there. And they're already planning for when some schools come back in either in person or hybrid mode, what do they do? And how's it going to change again next year? So even in the course of less than a year, they've gone through 3 or 4 major business model changes in their organization and their customers. And I think that's such an opportunity to really say, wow, what do we need to do now? And also, how do we get ahead of this?
I think that's a really key point, because it isn't, as you said, it's not just customer success. It can often be your fundamental business models that need to change, and where does customer success fit into that? I know a number of companies I worked with before, the way you look at your customer health scores, that you start those off with a series of some assumptions, you make an algorithm that you then you do need to revisit that on a regular basis as you learn more about your customers, what's working, what's not working. As you get more information, you're in a much better position to do it. But you've got to keep revalidating all these things. And I think that there's nothing wrong with revisiting your assumptions very frequently right now. I think it puts us in a really good place to do it if you're making sure that these are right. Probably not weekly, but keep reassessing them very regularly. And I think you've got to, the pandemic's a good example, because you want to revisit your assumptions and reassess them in response to other events. And when you've got external events that are impacting your customers, you need to revisit them. And I think one of the challenges we've got now, as we've just said, is that things are changing so frequently, almost on a daily basis with COVID, that you're having to reassess these assumptions very quickly. I think, let me throw the kind of next question back to you then, Jason. So what happens if you don't revisit your assumptions? What are the risks for us?
Yeah, I think this is one, so many organizations, they just get on autopilot and they don't take the actual time to stand down and say, what has changed? And they risk wasting a lot of time, effort, money on things that don't work or are no longer relevant or no longer needed. And they miss the opportunity to do other things that are much more impactful and get you where you need to go. As I talk about, if you don't take the time to say, are we still doing the right things here? Is this still what we need to do? And the answer may be yes. But if you don't do that, you really spend a lot of time, as I say, looking for the best answer to the wrong question. Yeah. And I think it's really important to stop and say, are we doing the right things? Is this still necessary? Is there a better way to do this? And one of the things I often challenge clients to say, what is it that you can stop doing or do less of that would free up resources or would have a huge impact on your business? So I think those are some important things there as well too. And I also look at, and you've brought this up a couple of times, let's not focus just on having activity, but really, are we having an impact? And is this getting us where we need to be? So I think there's a lot of issues around that. And if we don't have that impact, and if we're just having activity, you can really quickly reduce your internal support for customer success. I've worked with organizations and I've seen organizations, they brought in a team, they hired a bunch of staff, they got ready to go, they spent a bunch of money on tools and processes and things like this. And within 2 years, they lost faith in the organization having an impact. And they said, we're going to defund this and we're going to stop doing it. So there were some issues that I think could have been avoided. We've talked about that in some other podcasts about how to really get some support.
I think things like that are things that we've all seen as well, particularly go back a few years when CS, I think, was not as well understood as it is now. And people wanted to see very quick returns on it, very quick impact. And some of these things that weren't happening that quickly. And so there were a lot of issues where you were seeing that reducing in support for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, is that I think one of the assumptions I think people made early in the CS world is that CS would have a very short-term impact and you would see results very quickly, where it can do that, but it's more of the long-term play and it's more about long-term growth and development. And if you have a short-term mindset, you're going to be disappointed every time. Yeah. I think some of the other things too that we talked about in terms of if you're not revisiting your assumptions, you really do risk frustrating customers or actually creating a negative customer experience, which is the exact opposite of what you're trying to achieve. And I think this sort of comes back to a couple of things as well too. And more we talk about, are your customer success services competitive? And what does that need to look like? Because remember, all of your customers out there are getting exposed to CS from other vendors, and they're getting different flavors of customer success services, and they're getting different expectations around what is a good customer success service and what's a bad one. So if you're not market competitive and relevant to that, your customer may say, this CS service that this vendor is providing is really not what I need, and it's a waste of my time, and it's going to make it harder for you to delight your customers. So those are some things that I think of there. Can you think of other?
I think that one about the competitors is a really key one as well, because you've got to, I always talk about the key with customer centricity is to be able to change in response to your changing needs and demands of your customer. And that's really when you're aligned with the customer. Now you've got to add into that your competition's trying to do the same thing as well, and your competition's also changing and making their own kind of pitches and their own programs of work with the customers. And if you don't keep up with your competition as well as keeping up with your customers, you're in a real challenging situation. So you've got to look at all the different dynamics at play here. What's changing with my customer? What's changing the external market? And how are my competitors changing with this? And I think that's a really key one for me.
Yeah. I think to that end too, CS as an industry has been beating the drum, and it's getting louder and faster of outcomes, success for your customer. And customers are hearing this message quickly. And I think going forward, you're going to see them even looking even closer at each of their vendors and say, am I getting the outcomes I need from this vendor? And do I switch vendors? Or if I'm going to spend more money with a handful of vendors, I'm going to go where I'm getting the most outcomes, make the cut there. For if you're going for wallet share here, you better be able to deliver. And
I think that's a really key point, because it is as our customers get to understand customer success better and better, and they understand what works and what doesn't work, they're going to be working, as you say, working for the partners that can deliver that value for them.
Yep, absolutely. Jason, let me throw over to you. What are some of the most common or most dangerous false assumptions that we often see? Because I know there's quite a few out there that keep coming up.
There are, and I think this is something that I think both of us have seen this multiple times, and you still see it in conversations that you're having today. And I think a couple of the kind of ones that spring to mind, and in no particular order, customer success can be seen as an extension of customer support. I've seen that multiple times, and particularly when you as a CSM, you're being responsive to your customers, you're providing them with answers, you're helping facilitate those conversations. What they often try and do is bypass your existing support processes and come to you because it's quicker. But you've got to try and stop that. Customer success isn't just customer support. It's not that just being a reactive service. And I think that's a really big one. I think another assumption that I've seen many times is that customer success is a part of the sales organization. I get there's a case to be made that we're all in sales. In part, in customer success is about renewal, it's about upsell. But for me, I'm a strong believer that we're a separate function to a dedicated sales function. We're not out there generating new business. We're there keeping our customers growing, delivering value for them. And I think it's important to know that there is that differentiation there. And that can be challenging, particularly when you look at the different reporting structures that customer success has. Do you report into a sales leader? Do you report into the CEO? Just be very conscious of that. I think another one is, again, some people say this depends. I don't think it does, but there's an assumption that customer success shouldn't look after renewals and customer success shouldn't be commercial, and that you can't be a trusted partner or a trusted advisor if you're not commercial, or if you are commercial. And I don't think that's the case. We're all trying to deliver commercial value, and I think you have to understand what it is, what value you're delivering to your customers and how they can achieve that, and understanding the numbers behind it, I think really is important. The renewals piece is interesting because ultimately a renewal is just a transaction. The conversations that happen before a renewal absolutely have to sit with your customer success team. So I think a key one is your customer success team have a really key part to play in any renewals process, and it's important that.
I think that's so important too. It's amazing how many CS teams I work with where they're afraid to ask their customer for a renewal, or they're afraid to discuss this. And I'm like, look, the elephant's in the room. Everyone knows it's there. So just point it out and say, look, it will come as no surprise to you that we would like you to get so much value that you want to renew and use even more of our services. So let's talk about how we get there. And if it does help you to say, as a CS person, that, I'm not on commission, or I don't directly benefit if you do or not, but this is our company goal, you take all the energy away from that. You make it so much easier just to have those discussions, because your customer already knows that you want more of their business.
I think you're best placed to do that as well. You should know your customer better than anybody else. What's working, what's not working, the challenges that they've got. You've got to have that commercial understanding. I think that kind of feeds into the next assumption that I think a lot of people fall into, is that customer success owns the customers. You don't. Nobody owns the customers. The kind of best case is the whole business owns the customer. The whole business is responsible for your customers. It isn't just customer success. And then last assumption that I'd say is that customer success is responsible for NPS. And I've seen this multiple times, that it falls on customer success to make sure you're delivering a decent NPS score. A decent NPS. And I don't think that's the case. What customer success absolutely should be responsible for is making sure that you can deliver an NPS program and ask the questions and the surveys to your customers. But you can't be responsible for the score that comes back. Again, that's a whole business thing. It has impacts on the way they engage with you, the way they engage with your support team, the way they engage with product, the way the product works for them. So it's a much bigger thing. So they're just some of the ones that I can think of. Were there any others there, Jace, that you could add?
No, I think you've hit some really good ones. I love the idea of that customer success should own the customer, because I agree that's an organization wide. And I love about the NPS, because so often I think CS teams try to be held accountable for something outside of their control, when there's so many factors that influence net promoter score, from the product to the service to all these other departments. So holding anyone's feet to the fire for things that are outside of their control or span of influence is a recipe for disaster.
And I think a lot of these just kind of show a lack of understanding what it is. So part of our role as CS leaders is to help educate the business, understand where we are with this.
Yeah.
Let me throw the next one back to you then, Jason. What false assumptions do you think internal staff, so this could be our own teams, our own customer success staff, our sales teams, our execs, what false assumptions are they making about customer success?
Yeah, there are quite a few, and I often see different ones in different organizations, and luckily no organization is making all of them. But I think one is, right off the bat, customer success is a department, and it's not really an entire customer philosophy and methodology. This is not core of how we operate. This is not core of what our business is that it's customer outcomes and mutual success between us and the customer. If you really view it just as a department that's going to go deliver some customer success to the customers after the sale's complete, I think that's a bad assumption, and it's not going to serve anyone well. It's going to serve you well. It's not going to serve your CS team well. It's definitely not going to serve your customers. But I think one of the big ones that I've seen, I think with a lot of executives as well, especially in a more mature organization, especially if it's a company that's been around for hundreds of years kind of thing, is I think a lot of execs that I've encountered, they assume that having a customer success focused company in a CS program is not going to require a ton of internal change and disruption in their organization. And I think that they assume, hey, we can set up a customer success department and they'll do some work with the customers, and it'll be more of a professional service after the fact. But we really won't need to do a whole lot of different things internally to drive alignments. We won't need to change sales methodologies and processes and incentives. We're not going to change how people collaborate with product and product management and all these great things. And I think that's a really dangerous one, because I think we've talked about this a few times, that most organizations struggle with how much time and effort and internal disruption is required to get all the internal teams and departments to play well together. And it's a big thing. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that for me is a really key one. I think getting everybody internally aligned as to what you're trying to do, what makes your customers ultimately successful, is a really key thing. And I think that's a really important thing to do. I think another key thing when you talk about your customer success team, I think one of the big things there is them understanding that their customers know how to achieve success with the technology. And there's a big level of onboarding that you need to go through. And like you say, you talked about that mutual success, but how do you make sure your customers understand the need, not just to use the tool, but to drive change, how to drive adoption, how to measure outcomes, and how to measure those successful outcomes. And I think that quite often is a very difficult thing. And you sometimes just assume that your customers know all this.
Oh, yeah.
And I think you've also got the other assumption you can fall into is that all that we have to do as part of customer success is just make sure that the features, the functions work, and the customers will be able to get that adoption themselves. What you're missing is that whole piece around change management. And we're assuming that our customers understand this and have their own change programs, which is a big one. And I think there's a podcast episode that we did dedicated to change management, and there's more and more talk about it. Customer success is one of those teams that is becoming more and more at the forefront of change management. You can't assume that your customers understand there's a bigger piece than just picking up and using tools with this.
Oh, yeah. I've done a lot of change and user adoption projects over my career. And I was speaking with a former colleague just yesterday around a big client that he's working on right now, where they're implementing CRM, and neither the client staff internally or his consulting company that he works for really understands change management and the disruption to end users and how they have day jobs, they have all these other things. And simple things from the approach of, oh, we'll have a mandate to use it. No, that's not going to work. A lot of things. And if your customer doesn't have the experience around change and adoption, if they don't have the resources or the expertise in there, simply telling them, oh, you need to do some change or you need to get people to use it, that's great. That doesn't really help solve the problem. That doesn't enable them to do it. And I think that's the whole idea of you need to enable folks to do that. You don't just need to tell them to do it.
Absolutely. I think that for me is one of the biggest ones with this.
Yeah. Another one that I've seen internally, I think with sales, people, it's fascinating to watch the dynamic between sales and customer success and how it plays out in so many different ways. And I think one of the ones I've encountered quite frequently is on the sales side is that, oh, customer success is just a professional service. It's just something we do. We have a CS team, and sometimes they'll misrepresent it to the client about what they actually do, and they set false expectations. And the CS team has to walk back those expectations in an early meeting and already disrupted things for the customer. But I've seen that often in a lot of salespeople, they assume that they don't need to do anything differently or not much differently, and that things are not going to change for them. Where as we talk about CS becoming more of that competitive differentiator, as we talk about customers saying they're hearing the outcomes message, they're going to start to look at that. You need to be able to sell on, here's the outcomes and here's how we help you get there. You need to be able to set up the expectation from the start with the customer. We're looking for a long-term relationship here. And you need to have salespeople engage the customers in a way that gets the customer thinking about what is it that they need to do to drive change and success in their own organization. And that's got to be part of that whole mentality and approach right off the bat. It's very different to go to a customer today and say, here's our features and here's our function, and let me give you the slick demo in this very pure demo environment where we have pristine data and show you how great it could be, and which is potential. But then you get into the reality, which is the customer's world is messy. And if the customer doesn't understand that they need to do stuff, and that's going to be hard work for them to achieve success, regardless of which application they buy, because it's not about the application, that's going to make it very difficult. So I think as a sales folk, if you can get outside of this mindset of, I just do what I do before, I'm going to hit my numbers, I'm going to get my commission, everything will be fine, to really let that focus on how do I make sure I'm selling to the right people and setting them up for success so that they stay over the long term. That's a big change, I think, for sales folks. So those are just, I think, some of the ones that I'm thinking about. But Jason, let me now twist the conversation a little bit differently. What false assumptions do you think customers are making?
Well, that's a good one. And I think they do make false assumptions. And I think one of the challenges is that your customers often don't understand what customer success is, and therefore don't understand what the key functions you're there to do are, how you're delivering value for them, and how they should be engaging with you. And that really can be a contributor to lots of the other problems we're seeing here. I think one of the other biggest assumptions, that false assumptions we can make for our customers, or our customers can make, is that you are their go-to point for everything. And that, there are pros and cons of that. And I always talk about customer success as being a real facilitator. You are there to make sure that your customers get interactions with the right teams. They know what to do. They know who to engage with. But the flip side is that they inevitably come to you for every single question. We talked about support earlier on. They may come for you for pricing, for training. And what they also learn quickly is, but you as customer success give them the quickest response. It's just the way we work. And what they try and do is come to you and bypass the existing processes. So I think that really, for me, is probably the biggest one, is that customers, don't really understand what customer success is, and then don't understand how to engage with it. But then they also work with you as that go-to point for everything. So any question they've got, they will come to you. Were there any others that you could add to that?
Yeah, I think one that comes to mind related to that too is that I think a lot of CS teams they're onboarding customers and they're talking about success. They're talking about how great we are and we're here for you for everything. I think the customers have an assumption that, oh, they are here for us for everything, and that there's not boundaries. We talk about differentiated customer success services and what you're entitled to receive based on your program and your plan. And a lot of CS folks struggle with saying no to a customer that, I'm sorry, I can't help you with this. This is outside of the scope of what we're doing. And I have 10, 15, 500 other customers I've got to help. So I think customers need to understand that there are limitations to what it is that your customer success team can provide to you.
I think that's a really key one, though, because quite often we like to be in the business of saying yes.
Right.
You know, and you've got to learn and be able to say no at the right points. And sometimes you can't come to me for support. Please do this. And I think when you do that, you help build that trusted relationship with your customers. It's to make sure your customers get the most value. And by coming to you, bypassing processes, that doesn't help them ultimately. It's not the most efficient way of doing it. So what about kind of false assumptions that
Agreed.
we can be making ourselves, Jason? What do you think about those? Are there any false assumptions that we as customer success professionals are making?
Yeah, I think that's one too. It's so important. So I think you've got to take a really good look in the mirror, is I think what it really comes down to. And many of us, especially those of us who I think are really excited about customer success, enjoy the community, enjoy what's going on in the thought leadership and all the great stuff. But most of us probably assume that I don't need to change. The other people need to change, the processes and policies, they need to change. But I'm fine. I'm doing all the right things. I'm the thought leader kind of stuff. And I think we need to make sure that we take a step back and really question ourselves. Are we taking the right approach on things? Is this the best way? Is this still relevant? Has the environment changed, like we talked about early on here? So I think that's one of the ones right there, is assuming that everyone else needs to change and that we don't, is a big one. I think we also assume that we've got the right approach and that that what we advocate for is the best way or the most practical way or the easiest way. And that may not be. And that sometimes we've got to be comfortable saying, I've moved on in my thinking, or we tried this. And I think a lot of customer success is experimentation, and you need to be ready to say, we've tried this and this, we didn't quite get the results. Here's what we're going to do differently instead. And really look at that and say the assumptions we made about that didn't hold true. That's great. That's why we check, kind of thing. And then I think another one that I found is a lot of times as CS folks, especially if we're not the head of CS, we assume that we have less power to influence and drive change than we actually do. And I think we assume that we have less power internally, how we work with our own organization to influence how we relate to sales, how we relate to product management, how we relate to our own executives, that we don't, that if, unless we're senior in the organization, we're very experienced, that we can't have an impact. And I think similarly with customers, that there are a lot of things our customers need to do, but what we can always do is change how we engage with our customer to get them there.
I think that's
one of the
really key thing that isn't everybody has that ability to influence your customers and to help.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's really important to understand that. And you do. I think one of the challenges there is it really depends on the kind of culture within your organization. You know, a lot of organizations now are far more flat, far more collaborative. So this is less and less of a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some organizations where that hierarchical structure is still really key
right.
for how they work.
Yeah. One of the questions we often throw out in our training or consulting exercises, and we're talking about the need for changing behavior, whether it's of end users or other staff members or what it may be. And we throw out the question, you know, how do you change someone else's behavior?
Yeah.
And then we just sit quietly for a second and let people think. And we always get a few answers here and there that are close around things. The real answer for me is you don't. You can change your own behavior and you can change the environment, but only the individual can change their own behavior. So if you want to influence someone else's behavior, you want to help drive change in the organization, take a good look at yourself and say, what can I do differently that will influence their behavior? Or if you are in a position to change policies or process or the environment, if you have that ability to do that, great. What can you change there that will help change the behavior? So those are just some things that I think if you assume that you're powerless, that's pretty convenient, but that's really not the case. So anyway, I think with all that as a backdrop, let me throw this over to you. Do we need more agile customer success? Does customer success need to really be switching around here?
I think in one word, yes. I think absolutely. And if you look back at the recent podcast that we've done with Shanta, talking about customer success and whether you need to be product or subject matter experts or industry experts, she talked about customer success being situational chameleons. And I really love that. And for me, it sums up very well what we do and how we work. We have to be responsive to our customers' needs, wants, and outcomes, and shift our own focus depending on the situation. As I said earlier, this ability for us to change ourselves and to manage change for ourselves is a fundamental part of being customer success and what customer success is. Mm-hmm. And you really cannot be anything apart from being agile in the truest sense of the word. You know, sure, we need to plan, have playbooks, success plans, visions, but we need to be able to change. And as we said earlier, that being able to change in response to how your customers are changing really is, for me, it's the essence of what being customer centric is. So I think you do have to have a very agile approach to this, and change management is what we're doing. You know, we have to be ability to change with our customers. So those going back in this whole kind of podcast series, talking about validating our assumptions, reassessing the assumptions, don't worry about that. Do it as frequently as you need to, and go back and reassess them. Now, how do you work in an agile manner, like product, like development, where you have daily stand-ups? Do you have the idea of sprints? Maybe not. but there are certainly things that you can do to be more agile in the way you work.
Mhm. Absolutely.
I think, let me throw a question back to you, Jason. How do you check your assumptions? We're talking about you having the incorrect assumptions, but how do you check your assumptions and how do you validate them?
I think there are a few ways that you can do that. And like you were saying about being more agile, I'm a big fan of stopping regularly to take a brief pause and do that lesson learned and that review and say, if we just keep going on autopilot without stopping to see what's working, what's not, we set ourselves up for trouble. So I love the lesson learned review, remembering learning happens in the reflection, not in the act. While you're doing something, you're not learning, you're executing, you're getting stuff out there. When you stop and pause and really reflect and say, did this make a difference? And then question yourself, and how do I know? What evidence can I point to? And where does it need to land? So I think that's really important. And question everything. Ask questions of customers or internal staff and CS and other people, get their perspective. One of the things that I try to do that is been very helpful for me for several reasons, both when working internally or when working with clients, is try and say, here is my assumption, and this is why I recommend X, Y, and Z. Does this sound right to you? Is this the case? And by separating out my assumption from my recommendation, or my assumption from my path forward or my decision, it gives people a non-threatening way to come back and say, I'm not sure that assumption's correct. Let's take a look at that. And several times it's not. Oh, I had the false assumption, so we can talk about that. Now I'm not defensive about my position, but I've had a chance to learn and grow. So I think that's a good way to go. Stay active in communities and to learn about evolving practices. That's a pretty easy one to go and say, oh, was I making that assumption? Do I have that same situation here? What was I assuming that's different? Even coming back what you were saying about being agile, I would love for folks to actually document, whether it's monthly or quarterly, what assumption did we make? What evidence have we gathered? What have we learned? And what are we going to do differently about this? And keep that on an ongoing list or chart to come back to once a month, once a quarter, end of the year reviews, and use that as a way to guide how much you've improved and how much things have changed that may justify everything else. There may be even times by documenting your assumptions and the evidence that you have, you can go and say, look at how different our environment is now. Yes, we need these extra resources. Yes, we need this extra budget. Yes, we need whatever else based on these evidence-based factors. And it's hard to argue with that. So I think a lot of those things are pretty good. What about you? What else have you found?
I think you've got to be happy to go and talk to your customers about the assumptions. Do that validation. Make sure you're out there in the field, speaking with different customers, talking them through how you're working, talk to your different stakeholders. I think that regular communication is really important. And you've got to create a kind of a culture where people are willing to question assumptions and really willing to say, well, actually, that's no longer valid, and no, this is why it's not valid. So I think that communication is really key. And also when you state your assumptions at the beginning, make sure that they are communicated widely, so they're not just ones that you hold and no one else knows. So make sure it's a very collaborative way of doing it. And I think that's really important to do.
Yeah.
I think those are good. That focus on it is really key.
Yeah, I like what you said about stating your assumptions too, because I think when people share an assumption and they can come back and say, oh, it turns out this was not valid, or it's no longer valid, it moves you out of that being locked into a position. And it makes it a lot easier to, I'm not worried about saving face. I can evolve and grow. It tells everyone. One last thing that I would share that has been very helpful for me is try as an intentional exercise to write down your assumptions and then reverse your assumptions. And let me give you an example. So for one, we often talk to people that are implementing technology internally, and they'll be in the context of, do we need to change program, or what is this? And like, people have no choice but to use the system. We're just going to mandate it. We know we'll get 100% adoption because we mandate it. So we don't need to do anything. That's just the way it is. There'll be no way. That's one of my favorite ones. Trust me, there's always a way for people to get out of adopting a system as designed. But if I go to that client and I say, let me ask you this, if you reverse that assumption, how would your approach change? How would your resources change? How would your expectations for success change if you said people have total choice and freedom if they want to use the system or not? Or if we assume there is no mandate and we will get zero adoption if we don't take any action to drive adoption, how would that change your approach? So wherever you can, here's my assumption. Now, what happens if we reverse it? Does our path still make sense? And then let's have a discussion if we're really on the right way. And very simple to try and do. It takes a little bit of time, but can be very powerful. And then you can come back to people by planting that seed and say, what's our assumption here? Zero adoption, 100%. Is this approach still make sense? And that can really help people get the head nod, which I think is great. So to close this out then, Jason, how do we minimize the commercial impact of any false assumptions?
I think this is such a great question. It's really key to this. So it's we've got all these assumptions. Some of them may be wrong. How do we make sure we're minimizing the impact of these? And it is so important. And I think that the risk of many of these assumptions, false assumptions, or even I might say myths, is customer success team can get pulled into work and functions that they're not best set up for to deliver, and that they're not then focusing on delivering value and outcomes for their customers. And if they're not focusing on delivering outcomes, delivering successful values, ultimately that has to have a commercial impact and detrimental commercial impact on the customers. If you look at the example of support, if your customer success team get dragged into doing support more and more, they're not talking to the customers about how they can get more value from new features, new functions, how they might be able to use the service like other competitors of theirs are, other people in the market. So it's really important to make sure you're focusing on what you should be focusing on. And I think really what you've got to do to help minimize this is educate your customers, your internal stakeholders, from your execs down to across all the different teams, products, support, sales, and also your other team members within customer success, I'll get the word out, as to what customer success is really all about, and really set that vision and plan out. And it's something that I've done multiple times in the organizations I've gone into. When you're building out and leading a customer success program and team, is going there and state the vision up front, make sure it's understood wide across the business, and be collaborative. And I think that the key thing is that by helping educate the rest of the business, you really set yourself up for alignment, so that everyone knows from day one what you're meant to be doing. And everyone's then happy to be called out when things don't go. And I think it also lets you make sure that you've got to have the right processes in place, the right tools, and of course the right touch points in place. So make sure that you engage with your customers how they want to be engaged with, whether it's by phone, whether it's by text message or email. Set up that ability to do it. I think those are some of the really key things. And I like, as you said, this is something that is so important to make sure you do minimize any commercial impact of these false assumptions. That's my thoughts. Guys, thank you very much for joining us. We've really enjoyed the conversation. That's myself and Jason Whitehead. Don't forget our bold challenge for the day. We always like to recap this at the end. We want to challenge you to identify 3 or 5 assumptions that really form the basis of your customer success program, and then identify a couple of those, so 1 to 2 of those assumptions that you need to validate again now, either because of results of something like the pandemic or because of changing circumstances. But going into 2021, what are some of those assumptions that you are going to change? So a big thank you from me, Jason Noble, over here in London.
Yeah, and thank you from me, Jason Whitehead, over in Washington, D.C. Hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Bye, guys.